Hey, Alexis.
Hey, can you hear me? I'm testing
Yep,
testing the audio.
yep. Yes, yeah, and thankfully everyone can hear me. No more, no
For
more
all
repeats of the
yeah,
previous
yeah, yeah,
performance.
yeah.
So, look, Alexis, I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I think if everyone's okay in the chat, let us know if you have any changes about this. We're going to take it maybe two different directions. One is, from your perspective of an HR professional, but then also your perspective as someone who's, navigated the ups and downs and constant changes that are involved in working in technology. If that's okay.
Happy to go wherever the conversation takes us for sure. Love it.
And so, maybe if you want to share a little about your career journey, that could kind of serve as a great intro for people.
Sounds good. So I am a people leader with about 15 years of progressive HR experience. So I started my career back when we called it HR, but sometimes people ask me what people means, and what it really means is I look after the full scope of the candidate experience. So from the time you think to apply for a job, all the way through getting the job, and then into the company and that full employee experience.
Mm-hmm.
So the role I have right now, as was said earlier, VP of People at a company called Klue. I'm on week 3 with this new company, so I have new job vibes right now, which is good. But I've done the same role in a few different environments, including a tech company called Lupio recently for almost 6 years. Um, so that's a little bit about what I do. And then, Jared, you wanted me to go into journey, kind of how I got here?
Yeah, that'd be terrific.
Okay, awesome. So um, I got a psych degree in my undergraduate degree, and I graduated not knowing really what to do with that. I was tempted to maybe do a master's in psychology, but I really wanted to kind of get to work. So I found myself a job, like a lot of people do, at a tech company in
Mm-hmm.
sales. And I didn't love the sales side of that experience. I didn't love asking people for money, but this tech company, it was called Intuit Canada. I
Mm-hmm.
worked on the QuickBooks team. It was so people first, it was so culture focused that I was wowed by the fact that, people could do this. And I thought, like, why do people complain about work? This is amazing. There's all these great people having fun, solving problems. Wow. And so then from there, that's really being there was where I learned about their people and culture team. And from there, it was really about, navigating through my early mid 20s and trying to find kind of a core HR job. I ended up doing some kind of, I call them HR adjacent jobs. I did some training work. I worked in a career center, and then I found a role as a junior HR person at a travel company back in 2008. And I was there through the economic downturn in that
Mm-hmm.
followed that period, and certainly the travel industry was very impacted by that downturn. And so that was really incredible experience because I got to see, from a boom and bust perspective, how important the function of people and culture is. And then I worked in media after that. I was at CBC for about 6 years. I worked briefly in transportation and as a VP of people,
Mm-hmm.
and then was able to find the role at Lupio.
And
Um,
so, doing kind of all that, I mean, if I have, someone who's been in tech for a while, like that's kind of part of how this works, right? As you end up moving around a lot, companies that are super well funded and seem like a best bet, might end up rolling up after night or,
yeah,
sorry, overnight or all these different kind of things happen. And I'm wondering, how is it that you just kind of, other than, personal strength and perseverance, like how do you prepare for that kind of unpredictability?
yeah. I prepare for the unpredictability of an economic change and all of that piece, or unpredictability and changing roles.
Like, I mean, keeping your resume up to date, your network current, like, it's just
Love it.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think really it's always about when you think about what kind of problem you have to solve, it's about who not how, like your network and making connections with people is so important. And I think people lean on LinkedIn and making new connections as being the ticket to building a network. But I think it's
Hmm.
really important to not forget about the power of your existing network. So, who are the people you worked with in your last role? Because they're the people who've seen the value you bring. How, sometimes, especially after a period of layoff, like so many companies have gone through layoffs. So maybe you've been laid off for a company and you're looking and you're trying to figure out, how do I build my network and move forward? Don't forget that you worked with people that probably would be really great advocates for you, and you can reach back out to those folks, the folks you worked well with, and say like, hey, I'm brushing up my resume, like what
Yeah.
were three things I was good at, what's a
Oh.
story about me that you remember, and really asking people who know you to help you understand what you bring and the value you bring, and then you'll see yourself through their eyes. So I would say that's like tactic to helping manage a transition, career transition. Your past network, don't forget about it.
And one thing I love about that is the soft way of letting people know that you're looking, right?
Absolutely, yeah,
Hey, I'm
absolutely,
updating my resume versus like,
yeah.
some maybe more uncomfortable like conversation of, hey, my manager just got let go and I think I'm next.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or are you hiring? Like it's that's an important conversation too, and it's great to be bold, but kind of like we were just hearing from Scott, that informational interview, having a no strings attached conversation is so good, and you'll gain so much from that conversation.
And so, if someone's looking to from your experience more in an HR role, if someone's looking to transition into tech, um, are there kind of things or areas where you've seen people kind of benefit from more focus or learning advancement, that kind of thing, like some key learnings that people brought to it that would be helpful for others to know?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes a lot of people I've found at kind of these kinds of events. I've had folks that work in big corporate, like bigger companies, and want to get into tech. Give me a thumbs up if that's you or someone you know, so I know if it's like relevant. Okay, cool. I think there's so many benefits to big corporate. So 1,000 plus employee organization, call it. Um, and I saw this when I was at CBC, huge
Mm-hmm.
organization. Um, I think in tech, we always talk about wanting scrappy, curious people, and all of those things are true. But in the years you've spent in big corporate, you will probably have been exposed to systems and processes like Ian talked about earlier, and an understanding of like metrics and KPIs that most startups aren't as sophisticated at yet. So I think about, if you're working in big corporate now and you're not happy there, you want to transition to tech. Think about, what role am I in? What team am I in? What KPIs are we tracking? What metrics are we tracking?
Mm-hmm.
What initiatives tie to those KPIs, those key performance indicators? And then how are we tracking against them? So trying to use your time in big corporate and having you have at that moment the ability to see things at scale. Try to learn from that, and think about how you might apply that to being in a tech world. So I think about, from an HR or recruitment perspective, think about, what are the pass-through rates in our interviews? What are our offer acceptance rates? If I'm at a big bank, I probably have access and have an understanding or can learn about those KPIs. And now
Mm-hmm.
I'm interviewing for a recruitment job in tech. It's like, okay, these are the big things that drove our offer acceptance rates up. And so I would try to leverage that.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And what I'm going to do is, just so everyone in the audience knows, is in like 2-3 minutes, going to open this up to some questions. I know we already have some in the chat, so maybe we'll start there. Um, we have a question about interview process, but one thing I've seen sometimes is, like, what do you do in a situation where you think the ask might be unreasonable?
Uh-huh.
Prepare a deck and a presentation 3 times, do 4 coding tests. Like, how do
Yeah.
you? What are some polite ways to manage
Yeah,
that
that's
kind of
such a
ask
good
in the process?
question. That's such a good question. I think, like, first of all, asking about the full interview process at the beginning of the
Mhm.
candidate experience. So early on, they're going to say, what other questions do you have for us? They'll, like, almost everyone will ask you that. And so often I find candidates go, no, I'm good, because your brain is overwhelmed. But
Mhm.
a good question to always ask is, what are the next steps and what does the full interview process look like so I can best prepare myself for the full process? So asking them early on, and that will give you a sense of whether or not they have a full process that's baked out. And you want to be working for companies that are thinking thoughtfully about their interview process. So it gives you a sense of what's coming
Mhm.
and how much they know about what's coming. And then you write it down. You write down what they say. And then as these things come up, as these extra asks come up, now do a second presentation, now do another coding challenge. It's like, okay, hey, at the early on, we talked
Yeah.
about this interview process, and now there's added steps. Help me understand what the value is to this. I want to best understand it, and always posting it in like a help me understand. In the meantime, you might be choosing, like you might be going, these are small red flags for me. This is helping me understand that it's not the right fit for me. That's fair. That's your evaluation of them. But asking that question early. And I talked about, sorry, go ahead, Jared. I
No, no,
overtalked.
please.
Okay. I talked about writing things down and tracking. I was talking about this recently with a friend. I in interviewing for this job that I'm in now at Klue, I started writing down every interview that we held, when it happened, and who was in it. And I ended up with a 61 page interview summary document. It's like on the screen right here. And it was it's the first time in my career I've never been this organized, admittedly. But it was such a helpful document to refer back to because I could then say, okay, what did this person say about X? I could throw bits of it into ChatGPT and say, summarize the takeaways. Like there
Mhm.
were, so tracking your interviews and tracking what people say, it's so simple. But I think for me at least, I found it to be really, really valuable.
And one question I find that people sometimes think get uncomfortable to ask that tends to be pretty helpful for me is like, who makes the decision? How is the hiring decision made? Like, who's responsible for it? Because that can just kind of give you some perspective of, when you're meeting with someone, where do they sit in this whole process, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid question that you can ask as well. Certainly a valid question. I find that most teams, there will be a bit of an interview team
Mm-hmm.
that is designated. So it's generally the hiring manager. It's going to be sometimes adjacent managers or leaders that will work with this person. Sometimes an HR person or a recruiter will be part of that hiring team. And generally the hiring team consists of anywhere from 2 to 5 people. They kind of have a vote in the hiring process. They're going to grade you generally. Often it's on a scale of 1 to 4. 4 is a strong, super strong hire. Some might say heck yes. Then there's a yes, like a hire, and then 2 and 1
Mm-hmm.
being not as strong. So generally, that's the team that's going to make the decision. This is why it's so important for you to remember who you're meeting with and asking them follow ups, taking their LinkedIn profile. So then, like when you have a follow up conversation, you can say, well, John in this interview talked about this, and I thought it was neat because it connected to this question you just asked me. And then people see you pulling those dots together, and they're like, wow, this person's really engaged.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing I picked up on a little bit from what you just shared is the idea of this kind of 1 to 4 scale, right? I think that's helpful for people to consider is understanding kind of how the grading really happens. Like
Yeah.
it's not in the, you're not moving from a 7 to an 8. Rather, you're either making a fantastic impression, you know, okay one or not. So,
Yeah.
sometimes the question is like, how would you present yourself? And I think this is a really good lead into, we've had some questions that's about,
Cool.
what's a 10 out of 10 interview, some of the most memorable interviews you've ever had. Like, I think, thinking in that kind of perspective, that's probably what gets you ranked at 4 versus a 2 or a 1.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think it's not always about the person who has the most perfect profile, but it's also about how have the stories that they tell. I wrote down here in prep for this, like the power of real stories. Like, I a 10 out of 10 interview for me has someone who has technical expertise that I know, like they've got solid technical expertise. They have an ability to communicate their ideas that's clear. And then finally, they have like one or two memorable stories. I'll give an example of someone I worked with. She actually worked for me at my last job at Lupio. It was a recruiter who had gone through layoff, had been impacted by layoffs in the COVID during COVID. So she had been working at a tech company, been impacted by layoffs, and was looking for a role again. Couldn't find a role in tech, but she thought to herself, "Where are they hiring? They're not hiring in tech." And she found herself a role in healthcare and started hiring nurses. And so that story, like to this day, this is 4 years later, sticks with me. She told that story. It was a moment of, like, some will say failure, but certainly a layoff is absolutely not failure. But it was a hard moment for her. She was smart. She pivoted. And then she told that story. And it's like, this is a problem solver. I know I found a problem solver. So it's that technical expertise, it's communication, but it's also like real stories that connect.
No, I love that. I think that's a really great one. So yeah, if there's any more questions in the chat, I'm going to ask one more question of Alexis before we move into the networking portion. So, give you one last chance to get your questions in from the audience. How do you see, technology evolving? I guess you mentioned, that your user of ChatGPT or some of these Gen AI tools. Like, how would you recommend candidates think about using them for resume review, resume writing, cover letters, and such? I mean, would they be part of your toolkit?
Yes, like it's absolutely should be part of your toolkit with an asterisk.
Okay.
So so it's a big part of your interview prep, and it's a big part of, so for example, you see a job description, throw the job description into ChatGPT, give me 10 interview questions for this job, then you can give it a prompt, make these questions harder, and use those questions to then prepare for your interview. So often I hear people going like, I didn't know what they were going to ask me. Well, we now have a tool that will give you a sense of some things they will ask you. They're not going to nail it, but it's going to give you, you're not going to be shocked, and that prep will help you. So yes, use it. Use it to help get you to draft. A lot of people talk about this. Like, if you have an old resume and you want to update it, you want to add in your most recent job, you can use ChatGPT to say, update my resume with this job and summarize the job. Or you can say, give me better bullet points under my job. But don't use it as your final draft. Like, it is so not your final draft. You need to reread every word on that resume and make sure it sounds like a human wrote it. And also make sure it's infused with actual real stories about you as a person. So real numbers, something that is true to you and not just clearly canned out of ChatGPT. So tool, not solution, but definitely a tool for prep.
Yeah, I guess I had a question about going back to their previous role, even if it's, so that, eventually kind of can make a move to somewhere else. Have you seen any experience with people kind of coming back from other
Yeah.
organizations?
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. I have seen plenty of boomerangs in my last role, and already in 3 weeks at Klue, I've learned about some boomerangs as well. I think that's a great. It's there's nothing wrong with going back and saying, I learned all these skills and now I'm going to apply it again. You might come back to a different job. You could come back to a different team. So definitely maintaining those relationships. Sometimes you might discover the grass wasn't greener, and maybe you left because you thought, oh, there's something better out there. And actually where you were was what you were looking for. But sometimes, yeah. And sometimes it can just help you sharpen your skills. So absolutely no shame in a boomerang. That's for sure.
Okay, and we're going to take one more question. I really like this one. Thank you, Akos. Not the other questions aren't great, and hopefully, we'll get a chance to answer them in some of the breakouts. But how do you get actual feedback after a rejection?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think that is such a good question, and I think people can, it's tough to really get to the goods. you'll probably get the canned response first from the recruiter that says, or if you get now, I hope you get a response. But then if you get the response, you didn't get the role, always ask for feedback. Ask to jump on a call with someone. Most companies won't be excited about writing out feedback because it's number one, it's a task for them to do. Number two, they're now committing themselves in writing to why they didn't hire you. So many companies will be reticent of that. But say, hey, can I jump on a call with so and so from the interview process to get some feedback? And just a 10-15 minute call. You could ask for, especially if you're tracking who you're talking to, you could ask for anyone in that process and say, like, I'd love to understand, hiring manager ideally, but anyone else either as well. And just say, like, what could I have done to be 10% better? Like, I love questions like that where it wasn't, why didn't I get the job? That's accusatory. But look,
Mhm.
I'm looking to land a role. So what could I have done to be 10 or 20% better? What's like one, if I could change it? Yeah, always ask how to improve. What's a question I should have asked that I didn't ask? Like, when you left the interview, what did you leave thinking about? Like, what questions were unanswered in your head? So trying to get at questions, and you can brainstorm them ahead of time that aren't, um, they're not accusatory, and people are going to go, okay, that's a really open question. I'm happy to dive in with you.
That's a great note to leave it on. And so, Alexis, thank you so much for your time. I think this is a really interesting chat. Hopefully, everyone found it as informative as I did.